When the Coast Guard called me at midnight asking why my boat, the Golden Haven, was cruising 5 miles offshore with a dozen drunk people dancing on deck, I thought it was a prank. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, sitting up in bed, still jet-lagged after flying back from a week-long work trip in Seattle. "Sir," the officer said, "your registered vessel was just boarded. There are no life vests, unlicensed alcohol distribution, and no one on board has a boating license. We need you to come down to the marina immediately." By the time I got to the marina, the Golden Haven was tied up at the dock. Flashing red and blue lights painting her white hull. Uniformed officers were still questioning a group of partygoers in dresses and polo shirts. People I didn't recognize. And then I saw her standing stiffly, arms crossed, platinum blonde bob backlit by the deck lights. Livia Cartwright, president of the Serenity Shores Residents Association. I walked up to the officers. "That's my boat, Ferdinand Thayer. I didn't authorize any of this." One officer raised an eyebrow. "You know her," he gestured at Livia, who was now pretending not to see me. "She's the head of our HOA," I said. "What the hell is going on here?" The officer sighed and pointed to a clipboard. They claimed they had permission. By morning, I'd already spoken to a maritime lawyer, filed a police report for grand theft, and handed over surveillance footage from a motion-activated dock camera I'd installed 6 months earlier, footage that showed Livia unlocking the dock gate using a master key she had no legal right to possess, waving in a catering crew and directing them aboard the Golden Haven like she owned it. The footage also captured her slipping what looked like envelopes to 2 of the guests. One of whom was the association treasurer, Walter Wright. That wasn't just trespassing. That was conspiracy. Detective Mara Klein from the county's Property Crimes Division met me at the precinct later that afternoon. By late afternoon, a county patrol car was parked outside the HOA office. Detective Klein and another officer emerged with a file box and a laptop. Livia wasn't there. According to the officers, she'd left town that morning, something about a wellness retreat in Arizona. Coward. That didn't stop the process. Detective Klein confirmed they'd found emails between Olivia and Douglas discussing creative use of idle resident assets and how to frame the event as a sanctioned gathering to minimize liability. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening in the community center. By then, the whispers had turned into full-blown outrage. Several residents reported finding leftover garbage from the party in their trash bins. Olivia had apparently ordered cleanup crews to distribute the waste off-site so it wouldn't be traced back. When I stepped into the meeting hall, it was standing room only. Folding chairs had been dragged from storage, and even then, people were leaning against walls with arms crossed. Walter Wright sat near the front, pale and sweating. He'd been summoned by the detective earlier that day and clearly knew the walls were closing in. I walked to the podium, unrolling the petition and placing it in front of the secretary. "My name is Ferdinand Thayer. I'm the legal owner of 14 Serenity Bay and the private dock adjacent to it. As of Tuesday evening, my property was unlawfully accessed by members of this board and used without my permission for a private event. I filed charges with the county sheriff's office and have provided evidence to support those claims." Murmurs rippled through the room. I held up the printed email from Livia. This was sent from the HOA server. It proves premeditation. There was no misunderstanding. The murmurs turned into gasps. Applause thundered through the hall. Someone shouted, "About time," and others clapped harder. I didn't smile. I just gathered my papers and walked out into the night, the cool salt air brushing against my face like a reset button. Livia hadn't faced the full consequences yet, but the cracks had formed, and I wasn't done widening them. 2 days after the emergency meeting, I was called back to the precinct, not by Detective Klein this time, but by a federal investigator from the Department of Homeland Security. That raised my eyebrows. I arrived at the station expecting to clarify a few things about the boat incident. What I got instead was a broader picture and a hell of a lot more trouble than I thought Livia Cartwright could possibly cause. Agent Rafael Mendoza met me in a quiet conference room, sleeves rolled up, lean frame, and sharp eyes that scanned everything twice. "We've been monitoring irregularities tied to several coastal properties in this region," he began, sliding a file across the table. "Your HOA and its board president showed up on our radar last month." I opened the file. Inside were bank statements, association financial ledgers, and a scanned manifest of guests from the night of the incident. At the bottom of the guest list, 2 names were circled in red ink. That evening, I returned home to find a crowd gathered by the Marina Gate. Someone had taped a printout of the news article to the HOA bulletin board. Local HOA president under federal investigation for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Below it, someone had scribbled in permanent marker. So much for the summer gala. I recognized a few of the neighbors, Lisa from 2 doors down, the Danilos, who'd mostly kept to themselves, and even Mr. Roth, a retired firefighter who once told me he didn't get involved with politics. Now he was holding a clipboard. "We're forming a transitional committee," he said as I approached. "Until the state appoints an external administrator. Thought you might want in." On a quiet Wednesday morning, I walked into the county courthouse with a folder tucked beneath my arm labeled WPR Association Civil Action. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, windowless with wood-paneled walls that hummed with the dull groan of overhead fluorescents. At the front, Judge Harlan Whitford sat behind the bench with an expression that suggested he'd already read too much HOA nonsense for one lifetime. Walter Wright sat with his attorney at the defense table, thinner than I remembered, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His suit didn't quite fit, and his eyes avoided mine. The other 2 former board members, Janice and Peter, had opted for video appearances from their respective detainment locations, their feeds boxed in the corner of a wall-mounted screen. Livia's seat was empty. Her extradition had been delayed by 2 days due to a diplomatic formality, but the judge had ruled the case would proceed in her absence. My attorney, a sharp former JAG officer named Tanya Riley, stood and launched into the opening statement. 2 mornings later, I was summoned to testify before a grand jury. The hearing was held in a windowless room at the federal courthouse where I answered questions about the boat incident, the HOA's financial practices, and the emails Detective Clean had uncovered. The prosecuting attorney, a steely woman named Marissa Duvall, zeroed in on the Shell nonprofit. "Did you at any point receive communication from the Windward Coastal Enrichment Fund regarding donations or board decisions?" "No," I said. I'd never even heard of it until last week. "Did you authorize any use of your property, specifically your vessel or dock for association events?" "No, never," she nodded, satisfied. Behind her, the juror scribbled notes. Afterward, Mendoza met me outside the courtroom. "She's nailed," he said. "Not just for theft. We're adding charges for impersonation of a federal grant coordinator. Apparently, she forged a letter to secure a state subsidy for coastal education programs." "Let me guess." I said, "There are no programs." "None. Just a fake Shell website and some stock photos of kids holding fishing nets." I shook my head. "Unbelievable." "Believe it. She's not the first HOA president to go off the rails, but she's the first one I've seen try to launder money through a boat party." By the end of the week, Douglas had flipped. In his plea deal, he admitted to years of falsified invoices, including one for a non-existent seawall inspection that netted them $50,000 in one afternoon. In exchange for reduced sentencing, he gave up everything: Olivia's offshore contacts, her fake passport alias, even the name of the notary who'd helped them backdate forged signatures. That broke the case wide open. The state froze all HOA accounts. Contractors linked to the fraudulent invoices were blacklisted. The Windward Palms Association was placed under a temporary court conservatorship, and an independent forensic accountant began untangling the financial web Olivia had spun. Meanwhile, the Lucky Escape was in dry dock undergoing repairs. The Coast Guard had cleared her of any further violations, but it would take weeks to restore her to pre-party condition. One of the guests had tried to drill holes into the hull to install a champagne cooler. Another had flushed plastic cups down the head, bursting a pipe. I paid for the repairs out of pocket, knowing I'd get reimbursed eventually, but I didn't care about the money anymore. It wasn't about restitution. It was about making sure the next person who thought they could take something just because they wore a badge labeled HOA thought twice. One evening, while reviewing statements for a civil suit against the remaining board members, I received a call from Mendoza. "We got her where?" "Granada. She was trying to board a yacht registered under a fake company. Coast Guard flagged it. She'll be extradited within the week." I didn't say anything at first, just sat there staring at the wall of my study. Then I asked, "Was she alone?" "No, her notary was with her." So was a man we believe helped fabricate the property deeds. I thanked him and hung up. The next neighborhood meeting was held under the new transitional committee. Gone were the catered spreads and pompous speeches. Now we had folding chairs, notepads, and open discussion. I stood up near the end. We've got a lot of rebuilding to do, I said. Not just docs and budgets, trust, accountability, community. We let one person turn this place into their personal empire because it was easier not to ask questions. That ends now. When I finished, no one clapped. They just nodded. That was better. Approval is easy. Agreement takes work. And after everything we'd been through, the people of Windward Palms were finally ready to work. On a quiet Wednesday morning, I walked into the county courthouse with a folder tucked beneath my arm labeled WPR Association Civil Action. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, windowless with wood-paneled walls that hummed with the dull groan of overhead fluorescents. At the front, Judge Harlan Whitford sat behind the bench with an expression that suggested he'd already read too much HOA nonsense for one lifetime. Douglas Wright sat with his attorney at the defense table, thinner than I remembered, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His suit didn't quite fit, and his eyes avoided mine. The other two former board members, Janice and Peter, had opted for video appearances from their respective detainment locations, their feeds boxed in the corner of a wall-mounted screen. Olivia's seat was empty. Her extradition had been delayed by 2 days due to a diplomatic formality, but the judge had ruled the case would proceed in her absence. My attorney, a sharp former JAG officer named Tanya Riley, stood and launched into the opening statement. We intend to prove that the Windward Palms Residential Association under the leadership of these individuals knowingly exploited private property, misappropriated homeowner funds, and breached fiduciary duties for personal enrichment. We will also demonstrate that Mr. Taylor suffered material damages and reputational harm as a result of these unlawful actions. Judge Whitford didn't nod. He just scribbled something on a yellow legal pad and gestured for the first witness. We started with the marina's dock manager who confirmed the association had no legal access to my slip or vessel. Then came the forensic accountant who laid out a devastating timeline of money trails, inflated invoices, kickbacks disguised as community grants, and contractor payments routed through a Nevada-based LLC that had no employees or equipment. But it wasn't until Linda took the stand that things shifted from scandal to something darker. They told us the clubhouse construction was over budget, she said, hands trembling slightly. That we needed to approve an emergency dues increase, but I never saw any permits filed. And when I asked about the contractor, I was told it was handled internally. Tanya asked her to clarify. Did handled internally mean the board was overseeing the work themselves? No. Linda said it meant the contractor was Olivia's nephew. He doesn't even live in the state. He owns a landscaping business in Utah. I looked it up. The gallery murmured. Judge Whitford banged his gavel once. Tanya thanked Linda and called the next witness, a former HOA assistant named Rachel, barely out of college, who had quit 6 months earlier. They had me create fake meeting minutes, Rachel said, voice low but steady. Sometimes I'd be handed a list of decisions and told to make it sound like the community voted on them. I didn't know it was illegal at first. I was told it was common in private associations. The judge leaned forward. Did you ever witness signatures being forged? Rachel nodded. On 4 occasions, I saw Olivia sign names of members who were on vacation. She joked that if they didn't show up, they didn't get a say. Later that afternoon, Tanya called me to the stand. What was your first indication that something was wrong, she asked. The call from the Coast Guard, I said. I'd just gotten home from Seattle. They told me my boat was being used illegally by people I didn't know for a party I never authorized. She walked me through the footage, the damage, the repair costs. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. In your opinion, was this a one-time mistake? A simple misunderstanding? No, I said this was calculated. They knew I was out of town. They accessed a locked dock, tampered with my equipment, and used the vessel to entertain buyers involved in a fraudulent real estate scheme. That's not a misunderstanding. That's organized theft. The defense attorney, a gay-haired man who looked like he'd been dragged in from a golf course, stood up for cross-examination. Mr. Taylor, would you agree that the HOA routinely hosts community events? Yes. And that those events are sometimes held in shared spaces. My dock isn't shared. According to maps filed in, those maps were filed after the bylaws were written. The deed is clear. It's not association property. The judge cleared his throat. Counselor, the property lines have been verified by 3 independent records. Let's not waste time. The attorney sat down defeated. Tanya gave me a nod as I stepped down. The next day, the courtroom filled with reporters. News of the HOA scandal had gone statewide, and now the term dock gate was trending on local radio. The prosecution introduced a new piece of evidence, a USB drive seized from Olivia's laptop. It contained dozens of audio recordings she'd apparently kept voice memos of meetings. Maybe to protect herself or maybe because she was arrogant enough to believe she'd never get caught. One recording made the entire room go silent. A distorted voice. Olivia said, "If we get pushed back, we tell them it was a sanctioned event. If he sues, we tie him up in court until he gives up." Homeowners don't have the stomach for legal drama. Judge Whitford paused the playback and looked over his glasses. "Miss Riley, has this recording been authenticated?" "It has, Your Honor. The metadata matches the seized laptop, admitted into evidence." By the end of the week, the civil case had unraveled into a full-blown federal prosecution. Olivia's charges now included wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and falsifying legal documents. The judge ordered immediate asset freezes on all 3 board members. Their bank accounts, vehicles, and secondary properties were seized under the RICO statute. Douglas's plea deal was formally rescinded when it was revealed he'd withheld the existence of a second shell company. On the final day of proceedings, the judge issued summary judgments in favor of the plaintiffs, myself, and a group of homeowners who had joined the civil action. The HOA was dissolved by court order. Its remaining assets placed in a restitution fund to repay residents who had been defrauded over the years. As for my boat, the repairs were covered in full plus damages. But the real victory was structural. The county issued a new oversight mandate for all residential associations along the coast, requiring financial disclosures, annual audits, and rotating third-party compliance officers. Windward Palms would no longer be a private thief. It would be a neighborhood again. Outside the courthouse, I stood beside Tanya watching news vans pack up. "You ever think something like this would happen?" she asked, arms crossed. "Honestly," I said, "I figured I'd get a letter about my garbage can being out 20 minutes too long." "Not a federal racketeering case," she laughed softly. "Well, thanks for dragging me into it. I'll be dining out on this story for years." A few weeks later, I hosted a small get-together. Not a gala, not a fundraiser, just a barbecue with neighbors. No speeches, no votes, just people who had been through hell together, finally breathing clean air. Mr. Roth brought ribs. Linda made her famous lemon bars. Even the Danilos, who'd once considered moving, stayed late into the evening, their kids chasing each other barefoot across the lawn. As the sun dipped low over the bay, I walked down the dock and stepped onto the Lucky Escape. Her deck was clean, the repairs flawless. She looked better than she had in years. I sat behind the helm, engine off, and let the silence settle. No more forced compliance. No more threats tucked in envelopes. No more strangers treating my property like a free ride. Just water, wind, and the sound of a neighborhood finally healing. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived.